So last talk of the day is always a bit difficult, and I know I'm not going to be as entertaining as Todd, so I'm just hoping not to put you to sleep at this point. And can everybody hear me okay? Yeah? Okay, great. So, as Martin said, I'm not Genevieve, I'm Jill Prewitt, but I work with Genevieve at the NACMO Secretariat based in Tromsø, Norway. And I kind of stole this opportunity away from her by unwittingly planning a vacation to Alaska at the same time as this conference. So I get to come here and give the talk. So first of all, what is NAMCO? NAMCO is the North Atlantic Marine Mammal Commission, so we're on the other side of the Arctic again. And we are an intergovernmental regional fishery management organization, and we are official observers to the Arctic Council. And our member countries are Greenland, Iceland, the Faroe Islands, and Norway. And Canada and Russia are also range observers, and we have other observers, Japan and actually St. Kitts and Nevis. So we are an advisory body. We are advisory only, which means that our research and management recommendations are not binding. It's up to the member countries to implement that advice or not, but hopefully implement our recommendations. And we are the Marine Mammal Commission, so we're focusing on the conservation, management, and study of marine mammals. So in the NACMO Agreement, it's written in that the parties recognize the rights and needs of the coastal communities, and that they have committed to the effective conservation of marine mammals, sustainable and responsible utilization, and management decisions are based on the best available scientific advice and local knowledge. And although ecosystem-based approach has been written in from the beginning in the NACMO Agreement, implementation of this has been a little bit spotty and not very well implemented. But we're trying to change that as much as possible. In some ways because we don't have a choice at this point. As was mentioned yesterday, things are happening rapidly, and so we have to take everything into account. But currently, assessments have been primarily single species assessments and based mainly on abundance and trends data and the catch data. However, we're moving towards incorporating all of the impacts on marine mammals in our area, not just the direct catch, and keeping in mind the human needs, human activities, and the ecosystem interactions and changes. So to put it in context with the large marine ecosystems that are recognized by the Arctic Council, you can see our area actually includes 7, 8, or 9, depending on how you count it, large marine ecosystems. So we're right in there in this area. So in moving towards a more ecosystem approach, we've identified some of the major ecosystem services that marine mammals provide. Just some examples are nutrient cycling, carbon sequestration, and ecosystem interactions like predator-prey relationships, et cetera, et cetera. But a big part of it is that humans are part of the ecosystem, and they provision our communities with food, they have cultural importance, they can bring economic impacts into the communities through tourism, such as whale and seal watching, and we've seen the pictures of the Crystal Serenity, so now cruise ship activity potentially. They have educational benefits to our communities, basic research such as echolocation, sonar research, and some of these populations also have military importance. So those are just some of the ecosystem services that we've identified. So overall, we are the Marine Mammal Commission, so our objective is mainly sustainable populations of marine mammals, but also sustainable populations of the humans in our communities. So marine mammals and the humans, we would like both of them to be around for a long time. And because all of our member countries utilize marine mammals as a food source to some extent, hunting is an obvious place to start as a human impact that we can work towards managing. And this has actually been the focus primarily of NACMO from the beginning, is to manage the hunting impacts on the population. And hunting, it's actually relatively easy to manage. With good data, it's quantifiable. If you know the abundance and you have good data on the populations, you can have the regular assessments and the population modeling. And with well-managed quotas and catch reporting, you can somewhat easily manage the impact that hunting has on those populations. And if you look at the graphs, these are walrus and beluga population trajectories in West Greenland. And the green arrows indicate roughly when hunting quotas were introduced. And you can see, hopefully on these graphs, that when the quotas were introduced, declining population trajectories were stabilized or reversed. So again, showing that good data and good management, you can manage those impacts of the hunting on the populations. So now I'm going to go through some of the other impacts that humans can have on marine mammal populations and give some examples of how we're trying to manage those impacts. And throughout the rest of the talk, I'm just going to be giving some of the major highlights. This is certainly not comprehensive, and the examples are also not comprehensive, just trying to get a good overview of what we're facing. So the next activity that we can consider with impacts on marine mammals is fishing. And of course, bycatch is an impact from fishing activities that can have big consequences on marine mammal populations. And management must be flexible in order to be able to handle these issues. For example, the Norwegian management plan for gray and harbor seals was implemented in 2010, and it primarily dealt with instituting quotas for hunting. And it worked well for that. Until 2014, pretty severe and localized declines in gray seal populations were detected. And upon further investigation, it was linked to high bycatch rates in a new and growing monkfish fishery in these areas. So while the management plan worked very well for managing hunting, it did not include all of the impacts that we have on those species. So we've shifted now towards managing and mitigating the bycatch risk for these populations. So we've gone from only looking at hunting to using or incorporating bycatch risks as well. And of course, another impact of fishing on marine mammals is competition for prey. And we've seen some impacts, for example, with harbor porpoises shifting their diet in response to decreases in their preferred prey, and those decreases being linked to fishing pressure. So a big question for scientists and managers is, how do we monitor for new fisheries that are coming in and could have impacts on the marine mammal populations? Identify bycatch risks and predict possible prey competition with marine mammal species before problems develop. And of course, this is a big issue if fishing does start occurring more and more in the Arctic on populations that have never been exposed to these type of impacts before. Disturbance is a big category that could have impacts on marine mammal populations. And disturbance is basically just increased human activity in the Arctic, in our area. And disturbance can start from multiple places, first being tourism, from whale watching, seal watching, cruise ship, just other tourism activities. And these could impact the marine mammals with changes in behavior and distribution as they try to avoid maybe certain areas, which could lead to impacts on their foraging, reproduction, resting, and other key life history activities. And of course, a big one, resource extraction. In addition to the behavioral and distributional changes, it can also introduce noise into the environment, could have physical impacts, damage on individual animals, and then also the noise could cause masking of communication within the species. And the ellipses indicate that there's many other possible sources of disturbance and also impacts, but these are just a couple of examples. So a big question for scientists and managers is, how do we quantify the impacts and or mitigate the effects on the population level? So we may know how things are impacting an individual animal, but it doesn't matter so much when you're managing the whole population. So how do we get to the population level? And a thought question kind of is, what level of disturbance is acceptable? Of course, the severity of the disturbance makes a big difference. And also, which segment of the population is being affected could make a big difference. If you're affecting the moms and calves, that might be more important than affecting the males. Sorry, guys. But so what's acceptable? What's our threshold? Is 5% of the population disturbed? Is that okay? What about 10%? What about 20%? These are really difficult questions, but they have to be considered when we're trying to manage these populations. Shipping can kind of be related to disturbance. It can have a lot of the same impacts, but additional impacts as well. So shipping, again, introduces noise into the environment, but can also cause habitat destruction, especially if you consider ice breaking in areas where ice seals are breeding, molting, pupping. If you take an icebreaker and drive right through where a bunch of ringed seals are breeding, then that could have a big impact on the population. And the animals, some of their responses could be stress, loss or avoidance of key habitat, migration routes, masking of communication, but also ship strikes, which I'm going to give a more specific example now. So this graph, or this map, shows the narwhal summering aggregations in the Canadian High Arctic and West Greenland. And summering aggregations are the management unit for narwhal. And the red star indicates the location of a mine project. And the mining activities on land in and of itself are not of concern to the marine mammal populations. But what is a potential problem is that the plan is for ice breaking and shipping up to 10 months per year through this area. You can see the dotted line. And the Department of Fisheries and Oceans Canada did a model a few years back, and they estimated that up to 123 narwhal per year may be susceptible to ship strike through these activities. And this is significant because it's almost equal to the hunting quota of the Eclipse Sound summering aggregation. So it's a huge question. Where do you allocate these removals? If your scientists have modeled and said that this summering aggregation can handle around 100 removals from the population, you can't have 100 removals from hunting and 100 removals from shipping. So that's a question for managers and the communities as well. Another problem is that it's unknown where these ship strikes are affecting, which stock are they affecting. When we're managing hunting, with some species, some areas, and narwhal in particular, we have a fairly good handle on when hunting is occurring and which population or which stock those removals are coming from. But for ship strikes, it's a bit unknown which stock they're coming from. So maybe it's coming from a stock or an aggregation that you really don't want any removals to come from. Whereas with hunting, you have a little bit more flexibility to shift your removals from a different stock. Pollution is, of course, another big impact on marine mammals that we have to consider. And you can have direct impacts, for example, from oil spills, Deepwater Horizon, through physical contact. And this is probably a huge overstatement, but the effects from these single events may be quantifiable. Of course, there's huge uncertainty when there's a big oil spill, actually how many marine mammals you've affected. But there's, I think, even more uncertainty around the indirect impacts, such as habitat destruction, contamination of prey, and sublethal effects, such as reproductive failure that's been seen in harbor porpoises and killer whales in Europe that's been linked to contaminant load. And then, of course, underlying and in the foreground, all around, is climate change. So how do we manage all of these and the impacts that climate change is having on these populations as well? But the interesting thing to consider with marine mammals with climate change is also that some of these changes may have positive effects for some species and negative effects for others. For example, with the loss of sea ice, you have habitat loss for some species, but on the other hand, you have opening of new habitat for other species. You have competition with new species that might be entering the area, and similarly, predators that are entering the area. If you have killer whales moving into the Arctic more and more, good for the killer whales, more habitat, right? Maybe not so great for the narwhals who used to be able to escape predation from killer whales. And then, of course, large-scale ecosystem changes in addition, more ecosystem changes. And we've already seen changes in marine mammals related to these types of ecosystem changes, such as decreased minke whale body condition that have been linked to reductions in herring in the Norwegian Sea, and competition for prey with increasing cod stocks in the Barents Sea, sorry. And in the North Atlantic, in particular around Iceland, changes in sea surface temperature and salinity, leading to changes in distributions of fish and euphausiids, which are then linked to shifts in distributions of cetaceans. So lots of things going on that we need to keep in mind when we're managing marine mammals. So, of course, there's a lot of challenges in how do we deal with it. We have to be able to somewhat predict the future, to look ahead and try to head off some of these problems before they become serious. We have to be able to quantify the impacts as much as possible, and of course, all of these things could be happening all at once to a population, and so we need to look at the cumulative impacts, which may or may not be additive, they may be compounding. And then we talked a little bit yesterday about how advice might look different. How will the advice that we give to our member countries change? Up until this point, with just hunting quota as our main advice, that's relatively straightforward. You have a population of X, you can take Y. That's pretty easy. But then when you start throwing in all of these impacts, we may have to shift towards giving more options to managers, and they need to make the decisions. And I go back to the narwhal ship strike example. Where do you allocate those removals, shipping or hunting? Both of those impacts could bring positives to the community, so it also should be up to the community how they want that to play out. So now what are we trying to do to address some of these challenges? We held a Disturbance symposium last fall, which John actually talked about earlier today. I don't see him. We talked about the impacts of human activities on Arctic marine mammals and tried to identify some of the most important impacts and problems and mitigation actions that we might be able to recommend to our managers now. And then also looking to the future, some of up-and-coming problems. And we have expert working groups on bycatch, again, to look at the most problem areas and some of the mitigation that could take place. Looking at tourism as that increases, how is that going to impact our populations? And we want to do more with looking at the impact of pollution as well. And ellipses, again, maybe more stuff. So with that, I'll leave you with this talk or think about interactions and new species coming into the Arctic. And I'll take any questions.